Yeah, that was the right butt. So now we'll some more general diseases that we see. So brown rot of stone fruits, fairly common on peaches, other stone fruits, plums, things like that. And really, they'll just tend to look like this grayish to brown colored tufts that are actually growing out of it. And those tufts, those are the actual fungi. And so if you guys think back to signs versus symptoms, do you think that it's a sign or a symptom if we're seeing the actual fungi? Okay, so sign was the overwhelming answer in Lincoln, and that is correct. We're actually able to see the causal agent, so it's a sign of the pathogen. And here is a much more plum that's been much further along. And the other thing about this brown rot is it can just cause these kind of mummified fruit that we get. These, yeah, delicious. I would love to eat those, or I would not eat that actually. But one of the things about this mummified fruit is those are full of the fungal spores then. And so if you think about how many, all the fungi that's growing out of that fruit, hundreds, if not thousands, or even millions of spores are being produced on that. So one of the great ways to control brown rot is if you are seeing any of these mummies on your tree, make sure to get rid of them as soon as you can. Or if they've already dropped to the ground, try to get rid of those as well. Other just general management for brown rot. Again, sanitation is very important for this one and for all of our diseases. So remove all the rotted fruit and mummies that you find. Also, if there's a canker on the twig, go ahead and remove those too. Cankers can just, they will decrease the overall tree health. They're not able, those twigs or branches aren't able to get as many nutrients. That can make them much more susceptible to brown rot. Also, if there are any other wild plum thickets that are adjacent to the orchard, that's going to be a haven for the brown rot fungus in those wild plums. So if possible, try to remove any wild plums in the area. And fungicide applications will be a pretty good bet with a pretty good way to manage these fungi, this disease. So if you have a history of this disease in your orchard, this is one that you probably would want to do a preventative spray for. And you'd want to spray for it really right at pink. Pink, bloom, and then as the petals are falling. And so those three different timings. And if you're continuing to have disease, then you can even you may even want to apply a fungicide to the fruit, but you need to make sure that it's at least 1 month before you're harvesting, or whatever the label says as far as a pre-harvest interval. So anytime you're using a fungicide or any sort of pesticide, the label is the law. And if the label says that you can't harvest this fruit for 90 days, then you better not spray it on the fruit if you're going to harvest within 90 days. So the next one, it's one of these general molds of fruit. This is gray mold caused by botrytis. But this is very common on all sorts of berries. I have a thing of strawberries that's been in my fridge for about 3 or 4 days too long, and the bottom berries in that case, they're growing some of this gray fuzz. This is botrytis or gray mold. As far as management of gray mold, this is one that air circulation is very important. And so if you're able to choose a site that has good air circulation, not a whole lot of humidity, and good sunlight, that will really decrease the amount of gray mold that we get. Tend to see it a lot in the grocery store berries, because there's not a whole lot of air movement moving through those packages. Within those packages, it's just nice and stagnant. A lot of humidity, and the botrytis is just able to take off. Canopy pruning can really increase air movement and that will greatly decrease the amount of grain mold in your on your plants. This is especially effective if you have raspberries. You want to avoid crowding the plants, so make sure that they are properly spaced, that they have good airflow in between. Also, mulch is always good. Botrytis is one of those soil-borne fungi. So anytime if you do any sort of overhead watering, the soil that has the fungus in it can splash up onto the leaves and infect the plant that way. So if you're able to put down a good mulch barrier between the fruit and the soil, that's going to be a great way to cut down on grain mold. Also, same with the brown rot. If you are starting to see some infected fruit, you'll want to make sure to remove that material as soon as you can. Otherwise, you're just really increasing the amount of inoculum that's available. And if you have a history of grain mold, basically during the bloom period, you'll want to be doing a fungicide application just purely on a schedule. So really every 7 to 10 days, especially if if there are berries that you're hoping to sell or get some sort of economic benefit from. Next is bacterial wilt. This affects a lot of the cucurbits that we get. So your melons, tomatoes, things like that. And one of the nice things about bacterial wilt, so it really is just going to look like a sudden wilting of the vine or of the plant. Just over the course of a couple of days, that entire plant may go from looking really good to looking not good at all. And what might happen if you go and cut that plant take that stem and cut it, and try to slowly pull those two pieces of the stem apart, you may get something that looks like this bottom image that we have here. And that is those are strands of bacteria that have been flowing through the vascular tissue of the plant. But as we're pulling it apart, that bacteria is sticky, and so it's trying to stick together. But if you ever would see something like that, that's a sure sign that it is bacterial wilt. In addition to cucurbits, tomatoes, peppers also can get bacterial wilt. This disease is vectored by an insect, by the flea beetle. And so insect management is fairly important for controlling this pathogen. And if you're able to control the beetles, you should be able to greatly decrease the bacterial wilt that you have. Problem with any of these diseases that include insect management is you need to be very cognizant of your off-target effects of the insecticides if that's how you choose to manage it. Pollinators are very important. Bees are already kind of struggling. Would hate to harm the bees even more by going and spraying for these beetles. So if you are going to manage for bacterial wilt with insecticides, you'll want to try to apply those insecticides at a time when the bees aren't very active. And so also you'll want to use a selective insecticide if you can. So one of the things about bees being active, they tend to be more active early in the day and then also later in the afternoon. So kind of those dusk and dawn periods, that's when the bees are most active. So also avoid spraying any insecticides during those times too. Should really help your overall pollinator health. You want to make sure to remove and discard any infected plants that are in the garden. There are some varieties that are more or less resistant to bacterial wilt. So as with a lot of these other diseases I've talked about, choose the right plant for the right place. Also, we found that with bacterial wilt, reflective mulching works pretty well to decrease this. And so this would be a time where a plastic mulch would be more effective than a straw mulch or using wood chips. Next, tomato viruses. So tomatoes get all sorts of viruses. There's at least 10 to 12 tomato viruses that are considered common. And there's a lot more viruses that can infect tomatoes. But some of the main ones that we see around here: tomato bushy stunt, tomato mosaic, tomato spotted wilt, and also eggplant mosaic are some of the most common ones that we get. There's also a ring spot that we will see on occasion. And here is just what some of these, here we have pictures of the fruit, the virus infected fruit, but then also what the plants themselves look like. And the pictures are a little bit small, but the main takeaway from both of these pictures up at the top is, if you look closely, it's just kind of abnormal, almost mangled growth of the leaves. They don't seem to be going in their normal pattern. Some are cupped a lot more than they should be, or they're a lot smaller. Very typical of your virus diseases. As far as managing viruses on tomatoes, big thing is going to be controlling other weeds in the area. So generally we say to control weeds that are in that same family as tomatoes, but there's a lot of viruses that can affect tomatoes. So really try to control all the weeds that are around your tomatoes, and that should cut down on the amount of virus inoculum that's out there. Also, a great thing is to separate your vegetable garden from your flower beds. And so flowers can be a host for a lot of these viruses that infect tomatoes. And if the flowers are right next to the tomatoes, it's not going to be difficult for an insect, or you might accidentally transmit the virus as well. Really separating the vegetable garden and your flower beds really work for this. And as soon as you would notice an infected plant, so if you're starting to see the top part of the plant has just abnormal growth, or you're getting some of these curled leaves, but it's only one or two tomatoes in the area, when the rest are fine, make sure to remove those infected plants as soon as you can. And if you're really concerned, I would even remove the adjacent plants as well. Those may be infected with the virus, but just not showing symptoms yet. However, if, like me, you're just growing the tomatoes for home consumption, it really doesn't matter a whole lot if the tomatoes have any of these viruses that I've talked about. They only cut down on the aesthetics appeal of the tomatoes, but taste for all of these should be just fine. Also, want to select, so early in the season then if you planted quite a few tomatoes and now you're going out to rogue the weaker ones out, just make sure that you're selecting the most vigorous plants that you have. If a plant is otherwise extremely healthy, it's probably going to be able to combat that virus a little bit better than a spindly or overall unhealthy plant would. Also, controlling insects is a good idea for these. Again, insect vectors are the cause for a lot of these viruses. If you're able to control the insect vectors, you should be able to decrease the spread of the virus. But similar to bacterial wilt, you want to make sure that you're not hurting some of our very beneficial pollinators by controlling those insects.